What's the
I can't.
things over top of our head?
Those are candlelight.
Yeah. Live.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for Thriving with Rachael and Dr. Lou. Tonight we are opening up a discussion for live chat tonight to ask any questions that you might have about podcasts that we've posted so far, or if you just have any questions about thriving in general. We're not doing it through the Facebook feed. It's just pretty hard to try to read, I guess, and answer questions. So if you can use the go-to link that we posted earlier today, nobody is going to, it's anonymous. So anybody who calls in, you won't be on the screen. So if you have any questions, feel free to call in. Just be a 20-30 minute chat tonight, and then we'll stay tuned for the next one.
Sounds good.
All right.
And so we have a couple people who've already joined us.
Yeah.
If you guys wanted to either comment about some of the things that we've been talking about the last few weeks, or if you have particular questions that you wanted to ask either Rachel or myself about thriving, you're on. Feel free.
Hi. I can go first. I had a question about, I would say, like, keeping and maintaining your boundaries once you've set them, like how to keep up with them and how to make sure that you're still I guess like navigating through them the way that you wanted to when you initially had set your boundary.
Good question.
Yeah, great question.
So just in case everybody didn't hear that, how do you maintain boundaries once you, so like reinforcing the boundary once you set it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things to recognize that within this question, if you will, we're looking at motivation to behave in a certain way. So when we're setting these boundaries, keep in mind that boundaries are for ourselves, right? And if you have come to want these boundaries, there's certain reasons why you must have put them in place in the first place. And so one of the things that you can do to maintain them is simply each day keep in mind, why am I having these boundaries? What was happening before without these boundaries that I don't want, and what is it that I do want, so that I can keep reminding myself this is why I keep these boundaries in place. And that's usually one of the things that Rachel and I talk a lot about in terms of values, what's important to us, as opposed to our feelings. I think a lot of times boundaries kind of go by the wayside when our feelings kind of direct how we behave.
Yeah.
Or our decisions.
Which I think we've talked about before, this idea that sometimes feelings dictate, or I guess we take them as they dictate if something is right or wrong. So you might set a boundary that feels really good and you think it's a really positive change for your life, and then you might get negative feedback from the person that you set the boundary with. So sometimes it doesn't feel great, and so you feel like, oh, maybe that wasn't a good boundary to set, or maybe it wasn't right. And to really kind of check in, like Lou was just saying, of it's not necessarily a wrong boundary just because someone else doesn't like it, and to really go back to, is this for you, and why is it for you, why is it helpful, why is it beneficial? I do think even though they are for you, if you're in a relationship with somebody though that is a respected relationship, that it's really good to go back to the original boundary and kind of have a talk about it to kind of see, is there something that we need to do on either end of the boundary to, I guess, make the other person feel included in how that boundary is set. Because if it's a respected relationship, it could be a mutual boundary and not just, one-sided, I guess.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's always important in a relationship that we're communicating, right, and explaining why we're doing something and get that other person's feedback.
Right.
Because there might be certain changes on the other end of that relationship that person can make that may help you in either setting the boundary or perhaps not needing the boundary.
Right. Is there anything in particular, anybody on the call right now, or yourself in particular, struggling with the boundaries right now?
I definitely want to jump in if that's okay.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, I struggle with boundaries in instances where like the guilt just overtakes me becoming effective in setting the boundary. Like my parent is kind of dying and I need to set boundaries, but it's complicated because the guilt and shame of setting that boundary overtakes me doing it, but then I I wish that I do set the boundary. So it's really, what do you do in a situation like that where it's difficult?
That is difficult, very
Yeah.
difficult. And, you know.
Sorry to hear about your family member, first of all, that's
Yeah,
hard. And wanting to set a boundary, I think, is equally hard in that moment.
for
so,
sure.
Yeah.
'Cause, you know, we're all interested in taking care of each other. If we're in a relationship, typically we care about that other person and want to make them happy. And somebody who is not doing well health-wise, or in this particular situation, who is dying, which is, you know, really hard to manage your relationship with them, because you probably don't want to disappoint them, or, you know, if they want something, why not give it to them, so to speak. And so we're easily kind of convincing
Swayed.
ourselves and persuading ourselves to kind of go against what we think in our head is the right thing to do. And so I would recommend that we go back to, why are we setting that boundary? You know, is this a benefit to your loved one, and is it going to make things better for his or her life and your relationship by setting that boundary, or is it not? It could also be affecting your relationship with somebody else.
Sure.
You know, so if you're taking care of somebody else, but it's not necessarily, you have a relationship with somebody else. Like, so you're taking care of a parent,
Right.
but it's affecting your relationship in a marriage or something like that, then, you know, we have to keep in mind those boundaries as well.
And I think we've talked on a couple podcasts ago too about your values, and how sometimes you can have values that are kind of at odds with one another. So self-care might be a value to you, but then also caretaking might be a value to you. And so it sounds like if this is something that you struggle with both of those boundaries, or values rather, that might be kind of where the tug of war comes from. So really recognizing I can't reinforce those values 100%, you know, at the same time, because again, they do somewhat conflict, but really going back to your values, and am I caretaking because I feel guilty, like you mentioned, and this feels uncomfortable, or am I feeling like I'm not reinforcing a value? Because a lot of times you're setting a boundary because there's discomfort in the first place. There's something you're setting a boundary for, to protect you, and ultimately the other person is the idea. So to really be able to process, am I taking on guilt, you know, from someone else? Am I taking on something that's not really mine to have to own? So I don't know if that's maybe influencing where the guilt is coming from for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Or maybe, like, also, I guess you kind of answered that, but I know a lot of people struggle with boundaries at work because there's like authority and there's that tug of war there too. So how do you feel like I guess you might have answered it, sorry, but how would you navigate that then? Would you continue to reinforce your values and understand your values and what's driving you? Like, how, because that's a tough situation too, because
Absolutely.
there's authority and you want to be able to set a boundary, but you also don't want to get fired. So
exactly.
That's
I
a
mean,
good point.
there's a lot of pressure, right? If you're in a job situation that you are struggling with boundaries, or somebody else is struggling with keeping boundaries for you, expecting too many things, expecting things that are not part of your job description, you know, having you go above and beyond, whether it's, you know, taking calls after hours, doing emails, doing work that you're not getting paid for, so to speak, then it feels like you're being taken advantage of. In many ways you are. And so that naturally you want to have a boundary set there, but again, you might have responsibilities or pressures to keep that job because of maintaining a family life and maintaining a certain lifestyle or bills to pay.
I think it goes back to the values though. You know, we might value financial stability, but then you also
Yeah.
value, you know, having self-care time, and you don't have that time, you know, in this particular job. So I think it again goes back to the values, and not necessarily how do I enforce the boundary, because it sounds like you kind of know what the boundary is. It's evaluating over time, if this person is not respecting the boundary, you know, is there a way to better myself outside of that boundary that's not being respected? Or do I need to, you know, look for another job? You know, obviously we wouldn't go into it just saying, oh, it's totally fine, I'm gonna, you know, kick it to the ground until I get fired and that's fine. Because again, if you value financial stability, that's not great. But yeah, I would go back to the drawing board, because sometimes we're in relationships, whether it's with a coworker, boss, family member, that they don't respect our boundaries, and we have to evaluate, is that impeding on my well-being? And if it is, we might need to reevaluate the situation and what's in our control in that moment.
Yeah. And sometimes that's not a short fix, sometimes we may have to, like you said, look for another job, which may take a while.
Right.
I'm sorry, I think I cut you off.
I know you're good. I have a comment or a question. So personally, sometimes I kind of wait for people to cross whatever boundary that I've set, or maybe like I haven't communicated to them that this is something I'm uncomfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And then I tend to either reinforce my boundary or set a boundary, but in a very assertive manner that sometimes I feel like can rub people the wrong way because I've reached like a boiling point. So how would you go about maybe addressing a work boundary or a relationship boundary in a way that is like less aggressive? Does that make sense?
I'm wondering if you mean aggressive or if you mean like, what am I trying to say?
Assertive?
Did you say assertive or aggressive?
She said assertive.
Oh, yeah, I'm
But at
wondering,
the end
I'm
you-
sorry. I meant to say, I wonder if you mean assertive or if it comes across as aggressive, because you get to a boiling point. I'm trying to picture, if I was at a boiling point,
Yeah.
I'd probably be fuming at that point, and then I would probably, express a boundary in a less appropriate way, not really saying, when this happens, I feel this way, it would be helpful if you did this.
Yeah.
I feel like I would be like, you're being awful, and what's wrong with you, and stop doing whatever it is. So I don't know if that's kind of how what you're talking about as far as I get to a boiling point before I set these boundaries. I think being aware and in tune with yourself is really important in all this discussion about boundary setting, because you can't set a boundary until somebody violates you in some way. You wouldn't know that there's a boundary to set until something happens. You're not going to go around to every new person you meet and say, I really don't like it when you don't hold the door for me, so just make sure you do that. Think that's a stupid example, but you know what I mean?
We could do that, though.
I mean, we could do that, but until somebody violates something or makes some kind of experience uncomfortable for you, there's no boundary to set. So that piece of it, I believe, has to kind of take place before you know what boundary to set.
Yes and no. I think it's important for us to know what
our
we
boundaries
want
are, right?
as our boundaries.
Right.
And so, if we don't know that, then we don't always know when somebody's crossing them, because we're not
Sure.
having.
But I guess
Right.
at the same time, if I know what my boundary is, and then somebody violates it, then I would set the boundary. Like, do you
Yeah.
agree you wouldn't go around like
Correct.
setting a bunch
Yeah, I
of
wouldn't
boundaries
tell
with
everybody my
people?
boundaries before, right,
Yeah.
right. But so I think it's important for you to
Know
know your
yourself.
boundaries. But I think, I'm wondering, kind of what you're asking about is that boiling point is kind of the hot button here. Is that when you have had enough, obviously, but haven't really been setting those boundaries? So now it's coming across like you mean business, and it's coming across as aggressive, so to speak, but you mean it to be assertive. Is that more of what you're referring to?
Yes, yeah. So, for example, like you said, like let's say maybe my boss is having me work after hours, or
Right.
expecting me to complete tasks that are way out of what my job description was. I feel like maybe my go-to would be like, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'd get to a point where I would be like, you know what, this is crossing the line. And then once I deliver that this is too much for me, that this is not what we had previously negotiated, sometimes my delivery, I feel like, can come off extremely assertive when maybe it could just be a simple conversation.
Yeah, I think if you don't want to get to that point, right, it goes back to what do we want? And if the goal is I don't want to get to that boiling point, then the key is how do I start setting those boundaries a little bit stronger along the way so I don't get there.
Which I think goes back to the initial, I think where we started with the podcast actually was that awareness idea. So I need to be aware, number one, of my boundaries up front, but also I need to notice, when am I shifting from a place of being content? Noticing each time that it feels like it's uncomfortable, each time you feel taken advantage of, each time you feel like a boundary has been violated, being aware of that and mindful, so that if you do end up getting to a boiling point because you haven't set boundaries, you'd be able to check in with yourself and say, all right, I need to pause for a second and recognize I've had this conversation in my head for so long, and this person has not been clued into that conversation. So not saying that them violating it is not, is okay. We're not saying that's okay, but if we're the only one who's kind of clued into the boundary that we would like to set, then it's not really a fair, response. Yeah, like expectation of the other person to assume that boundary, which then also probably doesn't feel as fair when we blow up because we're like, at that boiling point. So I think awareness is really important, one, of what your boundaries are, but two, of have I set them yet? And if not, I need to kind of recognize, okay, I still want to set them though. So how can I do that now and moving forward, as opposed to they should have known, or, the dialogue that maybe has been in our head for this period of time.
And I think just to add on to the awareness piece, it's good to talk about this. Oftentimes we kind of either through guilt or through pressure or through trying to please, we tend to just go along and we say yes. And instead we get upset or frustrated by ourselves, but never tell anybody. And so it's important to be aware that I keep getting upset, so maybe I should do something. And so again, it also goes back to values and am I important? Is my boundary important? Is my self-care important? And if we are saying yes to that, then we need to be able to use that as motivation to start setting those boundaries early on throughout the course of that process.
Does that make sense?
Yes, completely. I think that was the awareness piece where you're kind of checking in, and every kind of little moment that something happens and you think, I really don't feel comfortable with this situation, then kind of acknowledging my feelings and how I want to proceed forward, rather than just being more of like, oh, okay, like I'll just go along with it for now. Letting it get to a point. The check-ins, I think, are very important with that, and just like you said, like being aware of how I'm feeling and what I feel is important, and how I want to be treated and how I want to treat others, kind of a thing.
Yeah, much easier said than done.
Oh,
So it's a work in progress,
Right?
right?
Yeah, I think I struggle with speaking up and being assertive. Like, I'm almost too soft-spoken with my boundaries, that they're not taken serious. Like, my kindness is taken as a weakness. So I think I'm struggling to be, like, more assertive before I blow up. To me, it seems like an extreme. I'm either being too soft or
You've been stepped
trying to set the boundary, or I'm boiled over and I'm, angry and clearly setting the boundary, like we just talked about, in maybe an unhelpful way. But I guess, yes, the awareness could help there too.
Go ahead.
No. We're always fighting to get in here.
Well, I was just also thinking another thing I think we mentioned in an earlier podcast too is this idea of being able to validate myself, because what I'm hearing from you is that, you're, like you said, either end of the spectrum, and that's got to feel really uncomfortable to shift from one extreme to the other and not really feel like you can control that shift. And so, like you said, the awareness, if I can kind of notice as I'm kind of building momentum, if you will. But once I get there, being able to validate the fact that, it sucks that it's hard for me to speak up. It sucks that I don't feel valuable enough to, deserve these boundaries, because sometimes that's where we are. And that's not an us thing. I guess I should say that isn't a thing that we need to work on, and that's something, though, that I don't think we cause. I think that's just kind of something that we struggle with sometimes. So really being able to validate yourself is important in those situations, because, like we said, it's easier said than done. So you might blow up. You might, not set boundaries. You might do these things and regret it later and be like, man, I wish I, had been more assertive and not aggressive. But to kind of give yourself grace and compassion that, sometimes when we get to that place, it's just hard. It's hard to set boundaries. It's vulnerable to do that. So I guess I just want to kind of add that piece in there.
And it depends on the situation, right? Like in some situations we might be softer, if you will, and others we might be able to set boundaries a lot easier,
Right.
depending on who that relationship's with, who the situation or scenario is with. And it's also important to keep in mind that you're not alone. Like, a lot of us do this. Even people who appear to be assertive have difficulties with this in certain situations. So it's something that we all struggle with. So as Rachel was pointing out, it's important to give ourselves grace and recognize that, some days we're doing it better off setting those boundaries and other days not so good. But that awareness, again, brings us back to how do we want to be, and if we stay tuned in a little bit more, we're more likely to stay on that path more consistently.
Good question, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know, did somebody else join us? If they did, do you have a question as well?
Putting people on the spot, shoot.
No?
Okay.
I did just join. I don't have a question right now, but I am intently listening.
Wonderful.
When it comes up, I will be the first to let you know.
Awesome.
Welcome.
Glad you're on.
Me too.
Any questions so far about what we've talked about at all?
For anybody?
I can go. I have another question.
Great.
It's kind of like jumping off of that topic, but I wanted to ask how to communicate effectively with someone who maybe is a bit more difficult to communicate with. Somebody who maybe doesn't like to express their feelings or doesn't, or maybe is like lacking quite a bit of self-awareness. How do you go about handling those situations as well as maybe like setting boundaries with those kinds of people?
Well, a question back for you. When you're having difficulty in that communication process, is it more you're struggling to communicate what it is that's your experience, or are you feeling like it's hard for that person to hear you?
Like to be receptive.
It's hard for that person to hear.
Okay. So,
Because sometimes,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, sometimes I feel like, like I've been to the IOP program, and I say things like, when you do X, it makes me feel this, and I think that it moving forward, maybe if we try to, I don't know, like set a time when we're going to speak about things that are going on between us that we need to work on, or things that we're having difficulties with, and then the person just doesn't really hear what you're saying, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things that I think is really important is to get, it's kind of like you have to invite the person to join you in the communication process or into the conversation. And so oftentimes I think we start conversations with people, but we haven't gotten their acceptance to the invite, right? So we think because they're standing in front of us looking at us that they've accepted our invitation to have this conversation. And so we're having the conversation, talking to them, they're not really hearing it, and then we're getting frustrated with them because they're not listening. I think one of the key ingredients to effective communication is that when we're ready to have that conversation, we both have to be ready. And we both verbally have to acknowledge that readiness. So one thing that you might want to try is whenever you're talking to this person, ask permission to have the conversation. Is this a good time to talk about X? Once you get that agreement, then you have a little bit more buy-in, right? And another key piece is as you're talking, it's important to listen, right? We often feel we want to be heard, but
So
we
you're
don't.
like planning the next thing before the person
Yeah.
finishes what they're saying.
And so it's important for us to take a breath and wait and let that other person respond to us to make sure that what we're telling them they're hearing
Right.
and it's accurate. Like they may hear it a totally different way than what we're intending. And so that's really important for them to be able to give us that feedback right then and there, because we could be 5-10 minutes into the conversation and they're still back over here, right? So
That might go into the permission thing too, though, because
Yeah.
the way that I heard you describing the way that you set boundaries sounded very scripted in a helpful way. So you're expressing how you feel and what would be helpful, like setting things time aside. It's very objective, so something that somebody could easily say yes or no to, which I think is really effective. But if somebody doesn't know how to do that, or know how to reflectively listen, so actually saying, I hear you saying this, that's something that we might have to invite them to as well. And I don't know if that's something that you've done before already, but being able to say, number one, is this a good time to have a conversation? And number two, in the past, we've struggled to kind of hear each other and, confirm that we understand. Could we use some type of, way of giving feedback? Like I'll say something and you can repeat back what you heard so that I can confirm whether or not that's accurate, and vice versa. So then the other person would have that option as well, and you would have to reflectively listen as well. It kind of sets up the expectation for the boundary setting and for that conversation, so there's less ambiguity, I guess, and fear around what's going to happen during that conversation.
Yeah.
So.
Thoughts about that? Does that make sense? Questions?
Yes, I like the idea of like saying something and then having the person repeat it back, because I do think that in the issue that I'm speaking about with this communication with this particular person, that it tends to be a lot of speaking at each other and not a lot of like digesting what the other person is saying and actually listening. Like you had mentioned that we're ready to go with like the next thing in our mind because we've thought about it for so long, and we've got in our head that we're right, and our perception is of what we've seen, but actually like going back and forth, listening, having the person repeat what you were saying or what they heard, I think would be a really helpful step in communicating with somebody maybe who doesn't know necessarily the best tools to helpfully communicate. So.
Yeah. Keep in mind, communication is not something that we typically teach, right? We learn about math, history, English, all this other stuff, but we rarely teach communication, and it's the most essential skill that we have to learn, right? Especially listening, which is even more important than talking. And I think sometimes we just expect that we know how to communicate, or that we expect the other communicates just like we do. And so it's really important to actually have the conversation about communicating. And that sounds weird, right? It feels weird too, and awkward to ask somebody to repeat back to me what I just said to them. It will be weird. It will be awkward.
It'll sound robotic at first, probably.
Yeah, and that's okay. It's because, one, we're not used to doing it, and two, we haven't made it ours. It's more of this process right now, or this script that we're following, as opposed to a real conversation. So through practicing that, by doing it, it becomes your own, and you make it your own.
Does that make sense for everybody?
I have a question kind of bouncing off of that. Like,
Sure.
in terms of other people, when you realize, like, okay, I don't have direct control over other people, like, that's very
Frustrating?
logical in your mind,
Yeah.
and you still can't get over it. Like, what do you do in those moments? Like, you're just holding on to, I guess, something. What do you do?
You just want to
When you
shake them
just
and be
can't
like,
get
listen.
over it.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes we get mad,
Right.
right? Sometimes we get frustrated. Sometimes we walk away. Sometimes we call another friend and just go on a tirade and complain. But I think you're asking, what do we do to change that, right? How do we get that person kind of on board?
Or how do I not get so frustrated? I'm not sure which way.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Here.
I think I'm thinking, like, how do I let it go?
Yeah.
Like, how I logically know that I cannot control you or can't control the past,
Right.
and yet I'm gripping onto it. I'm still,
Holding on for dear life.
yes.
Well, keep in mind that if we're holding on to it, it's kind of hard to move away from it, right? So
Definitely.
So oftentimes we want to stop doing something. And every time we try to stop doing that thing, we actually are touching it, talking about it, thinking about it, focusing on it, giving it life, giving it energy, giving it our time. Instead, Rachel and I often talk about we need to move on to what we want. So if you talk about, I don't want to be stuck with this, I want to get over this. Well, what's over it? What's on the other side? Where do I want to go instead of feel frustrated, complaining or upset or bothered, what is that?
Like what would exist
Yeah.
if that didn't? Which I think is a hard question to answer.
Well, not even that it won't exist, because it does, right? But more importantly, are you talking about my frustration or?
More so, what would, if I wasn't focused on the frustration, what would I want to be focused
Yes,
on, I guess,
yeah.
is more so what I
Yeah.
meant.
Like, what would it look like?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. What would you be
Yeah.
doing? If you weren't frustrated, if you weren't stuck on trying to control this person, even though logically you know you can't, what would you be doing?
right.
What would you be thinking? Where would you be? Would you be in that same spot physically
Right.
and literally? Is it something that you would be talking to somebody else, going on to, some other activity, reading a book?
But I think that needs to be a rule of thumb. Whenever you're noticing that you're trying to make something stop, decrease, eliminate something, use that as kind of a key word to yourself that that's not the goal. That's going to be a possible outcome to a goal, but the goal is something active and measurable, something you're going to pursue, something you're going to put energy towards. Like Lou was saying a second ago, if you're putting energy towards getting rid of something, then you're not going to be able to get rid of it because you're holding on so tight to see if you're getting rid of it. So you need to redirect energy to what would I want instead, and that easily will make us let go of this other thing. Doesn't mean it won't come back up.
Right.
Doesn't mean it's gone. It's
Right.
probably
It's
still
still
there.
there.
It's the idea that we're trying to kind of build more pieces of the puzzle, fill up the cup a little bit more with other things, so the percentage of whatever attentions that's getting is automatically decreasing. So yeah, that's a tough spot to be though, to get over it. Because to your point, we don't control other people, we don't control our feelings. So those are a couple of things we have to kind of hone in on.
This has been a great
I was
conversation.
gonna say, I wanna kind
I
of
just
continue it,
noticed
but I
the
just
time here.
noticed the time that we have to kind of wrap up here. But any last minute questions to clarify anything that we've talked about today that we could answer for you guys?
No, thank you so much.
Thank you guys
Oh,
for
thank
coming
you.
on. We appreciate it.
It's been awesome.
Yeah, it was so great.
Hopefully we can do this again. Our goal is to do this the first Wednesday.
Yeah.
First Wednesday.
First
First
Wednesday.
Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. Same format as this. If anybody has any feedback on how to do it better, we're newbies at this,
Yeah.
so any feedback would be really helpful. So thank you again. Hope you guys have a great night.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
See ya. Thank you.